At 6:47 a.m., a wheel clamp snapped shut onto a truck parked right on private property, the metal locking in with a sharp echo through the quiet street. Within minutes, the HOA arrived, calm and confident, claiming they had full authority to hold the vehicle until every last dollar in fines was paid. No hesitation, no discussion, just control. But later that day, when the homeowner pulled out an old, forgotten binder from a dusty shelf and slowly flipped it open, he found something buried inside those pages. Something so unexpected that it instantly drained the color from the entire HOA board's faces, and left the whole situation in complete silence. The metal wheel clamp snapped shut with a sharp clang at exactly 6:47 a.m., locking all four tires of a black pickup truck in the middle of a suburban driveway, while a private security guard held up a citation demanding $4,850 in unpaid HOA penalties. 3 neighbors had already stepped onto their lawns to watch. The homeowner stood frozen, coffee still in hand, staring at a bright yellow notice taped across the windshield. The guard pointed toward the gated entrance and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "This vehicle isn't leaving until every dollar is paid." The morning air smelled like wet grass from overnight sprinklers. Birds chirped from nearby oak trees, as if nothing unusual was happening. But something about the situation felt wrong. The truck wasn't parked on a community road. It wasn't blocking traffic. It wasn't even on HOA property. It sat entirely inside a private driveway attached to a single-family home. The homeowner demanded an explanation. The guard simply handed over another notice. Then came the detail that made several neighbors stop watering their lawns. According to the document, the HOA claimed authority to immobilize any vehicle belonging to residents with unresolved violations. There was only one problem. The homeowner had never received notice of most of those violations. And hidden inside a folder less than 50 feet away was a document that would soon change everything. Keyframe 2, the setup. Mark Reynolds had lived in the neighborhood long enough to remember when the streets were nothing more than fresh asphalt and construction signs. 14 years earlier, he and his wife had chosen the community because it represented stability. The houses were new, the sidewalks were wide, and the Homeowners Association marketed itself as a simple safeguard against neglected properties and declining home values. Back then, the HOA brochures showed smiling families at neighborhood barbecues and promised a peaceful environment built on reasonable standards and mutual respect. For most of those 14 years, Mark hardly thought about the HOA at all. He paid his monthly dues on time. He kept his lawn trimmed every Saturday morning. He pressure washed the driveway once a year, replaced broken fence boards when needed, and waved politely to neighbors during evening walks. His black pickup truck sat in the same driveway every night without issue. He wasn't the kind of homeowner who looked for conflict. In fact, most residents knew him as the quiet guy at the end of the cul-de-sac who helped jump-start dead car batteries and loaned out his ladder during holiday decorating season. The neighborhood itself had a rhythm. Every weekday morning, the electronic gate near the entrance opened with its familiar mechanical hum as commuters headed to work. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the air during landscaping days. Children raced bicycles down the sidewalks while parents chatted from their front porches. It felt predictable. Safe. Then the HOA board changed. A newly elected group took control after campaigning on promises of stricter enforcement and stronger protection of property values. At first, many residents supported the idea. Nobody wanted abandoned vehicles, neglected homes, or genuine nuisances lowering the quality of life. But the warning letters started arriving. One homeowner received a citation because a basketball hoop remained visible from the street. Another was fined over the color of replacement shutters. Residents began comparing notices during casual conversations at community mailboxes. Mark's first violation involved a decorative flower planter near his front steps. The next concerned the shade of paint used on his mailbox after he'd touched up a few chipped spots. Weeks later, another letter arrived questioning holiday decorations that had remained displayed 2 days longer than allowed. Each certified envelope felt heavier than the last. As he stood in his kitchen opening yet another official notice, the stiff paper crackled in his hands. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but it no longer brought comfort. The numbers printed across the page kept growing. For the first time in 14 years, Mark realized the neighborhood he thought he understood had changed, and he had no idea how much worse things were about to become. The situation escalated so quickly that Mark barely had time to process one violation notice before another appeared. Within 48 hours of the wheel clamp being fastened onto his pickup truck, private security officers seemed to become permanent fixtures in the neighborhood. Residents noticed them slowly driving through the streets in marked vehicles, stopping near homes with clipboards and cameras in hand. At first, Mark tried convincing himself it was routine enforcement. But when he spotted the same officer photographing his property for the third time in a single week, it stopped feeling routine and started feeling personal. One bright Tuesday morning, Mark pulled back the living room curtains and watched as a security guard stood near the sidewalk, aiming a camera toward his front yard. The click of the shutter echoed faintly through the glass. The officer took pictures of the flower beds, the mailbox, and even the side of the driveway before writing notes onto a clipboard. Mark stepped outside. "Can I ask what exactly you're documenting?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer glanced up briefly. "Just following instructions," he replied. "If you have questions, you'll need to contact the management office." Then he returned to taking photographs. The notices multiplied. One cited a garden hose coiled beside the house. Another mentioned a small crack in the driveway concrete that Mark had honestly never noticed before. A third questioned a decorative flag hanging from the front porch. Each violation carried its own administrative fee. Each warning included language that sounded increasingly threatening. The bright orange envelopes arrived with such frequency that Mark developed a knot in his stomach every time he checked the mailbox. Some notices appeared by certified mail. Others were taped directly to his front door for neighbors passing by to see. Then came the public embarrassment. During the next HOA meeting, board members praised their commitment to stronger enforcement practices. Without mentioning names, they referenced homeowners who repeatedly ignored community standards and accumulated penalties. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew exactly who they meant. Outside, Mark's black pickup truck remained trapped beneath the yellow wheel clamp sitting prominently in his driveway. Children riding bicycles slowed to stare. Neighbors walking their dogs glanced toward the house before quickly looking away. The clamp had become more than an enforcement tool. It had become a warning. Every day it sat there under the afternoon sun, gleaming like a symbol of authority the board wanted everyone else to notice. But while the HOA continued building its case against him, another story had already begun unfolding behind closed garage doors. And this time, Mark wasn't simply reacting. He was preparing. Just when Mark thought the situation couldn't become any more absurd, another certified envelope arrived. It was waiting in his mailbox on a Thursday afternoon, wedged between grocery store advertisements and utility statements. The envelope itself looked official, thick cream-colored paper stamped with the HOA management company's logo in the upper corner. Even before opening it, Mark felt the now familiar tightness settle in his chest. Standing in his kitchen beneath the soft glow of the overhead lights, he carefully unfolded the documents. His eyes immediately locked onto the total. $7,320. He read the figure twice, convinced he had misunderstood it. The original fines had somehow multiplied into something far more serious. Administrative processing fees had been added. Hearing expenses had appeared without explanation. Security enforcement charges had been included. Late penalties had accumulated on top of previous penalties. The pages listed line after line of additional costs, transforming what had begun as minor disputes over landscaping and decorations into a financial burden large enough to threaten a family's savings. Mark spread the paperwork across the kitchen table. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room, untouched in its mug as it slowly grew cold. Some of the charges made little sense. Several enforcement dates didn't match his records. A few entries lacked any meaningful explanation at all. When he contacted the management company requesting documentation supporting the fees, he was transferred from one representative to another before finally being told that someone would follow up in due course. No one did. Then came another surprise. A neighborhood newsletter appeared in residents' mailboxes that weekend. Most of its contents were harmless community updates, landscaping schedules, pool maintenance reminders, and upcoming social events. But buried near the final pages was a section praising the HOA board's commitment to holding repeat violators accountable. It celebrated stronger enforcement efforts. It applauded leadership for protecting community standards. No names were printed. Yet the references felt painfully obvious. Neighbors began whispering during evening walks. Conversations stopped when Mark approached. Parents standing beside playground equipment exchanged uncomfortable glances before changing the subject entirely. Even local children had started asking innocent questions. Why can't that truck move? Every morning, Mark looked out his front window and saw the yellow wheel clamp still attached to his pickup truck, sitting in plain view like a public display meant to send a message. The HOA wanted compliance. But the deeper Mark examined the growing stack of notices and unexplained charges, the more one troubling thought refused to leave him alone. This wasn't just aggressive enforcement anymore. Somewhere within the board's actions, something wasn't adding up. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Mark stopped asking how much worse things could get. Instead, he started asking whether the people enforcing the rules had actually followed them themselves. By Saturday morning, frustration had given way to determination. Mark parked himself inside the garage with a folding chair, a bottle of water, and the growing stack of HOA notices that had taken over his kitchen table during the previous weeks. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil, old cardboard, and sawdust from long-forgotten home improvement projects. Sunlight filtered through the small windows near the ceiling, sending narrow beams of light across shelves packed with storage bins and dusty boxes. If the HOA insisted its actions were justified, Mark wanted to see exactly what authority they were relying on. He dragged an old metal filing cabinet away from the wall and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were years of paperwork he hadn't touched since moving into the neighborhood: tax records, appliance warranties, insurance documents, and closing paperwork from when he purchased the house 14 years earlier. Most people would have given up after the first hour. Mark kept going. He opened a thick 3-ring binder labeled Property Documents in fading black marker. Inside were copies of surveys, title paperwork, recorded declarations, easement maps, and the original governing documents provided at closing. Dust clung to the edges of the pages as he carefully flipped through them. Page after page revealed language he hadn't thought about in years. Then something caught his attention. He stopped. His eyes returned to a paragraph he had almost skipped. He read it once. Then again. The wording was unusually specific. He leaned closer, tracing the lines with his finger to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding what he was seeing. Nearby sat another folder containing old HOA correspondence and meeting minutes collected over the years. Mark opened that one too. As afternoon sunlight shifted across the garage floor, he began comparing documents side by side. Certain dates didn't align. Certain references raised questions he hadn't considered before. For the first time since the wheel clamp appeared in his driveway, the constant feeling of helplessness began to fade. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. But the panic that had followed him for weeks was slowly being replaced by something far more dangerous to the people who had underestimated him. Confidence. Mark reached for his phone and photographed several pages from the binder before sending them to someone he trusted to review them. Then he carefully placed the most important documents into a separate folder. By the time evening arrived, he still didn't know exactly how the situation would end. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The story the HOA had been telling wasn't the complete story. Monday morning arrived with the same uneasy silence that had settled over the neighborhood since the wheel clamp first appeared. The electronic gate at the community entrance opened and closed with its familiar mechanical hum as residents headed off to work, many pretending not to notice the growing conflict that had become the neighborhood's worst-kept secret. Mark had spent the weekend reviewing documents and organizing his notes. The slim folder tucked beneath his arm now contained carefully arranged copies of declarations, meeting records, and highlighted pages that had raised serious questions. He wasn't interested in making threats or creating a scene. He wanted answers. Near the entrance gate, he spotted the same private security guard who had helped enforce the immobilization order against his truck. Mark approached calmly. "Can I ask you something?" he said. The guard shifted his weight but nodded. "Who specifically authorized the wheel clamp?" "The HOA board," the guard answered without hesitation. "Based on what authority?" For the first time, the guard seemed uncertain. He adjusted the clipboard in his hands and glanced toward the management office. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's above my pay grade. We just follow instructions." It wasn't the answer Mark wanted, but it confirmed something important. The people carrying out the enforcement actions weren't asking questions either. Later that afternoon, Mark attended another HOA hearing inside the community clubhouse. The air conditioning hummed overhead while board members sat behind a polished conference table stacked with neatly organized files. One board member looked up as Mark entered. "Have you brought payment today?" he asked flatly. "No," Mark replied, placing his folder on the table. "I've brought questions." A few board members exchanged irritated glances. "We've already discussed this matter," another said. Then identifying the section that authorizes immobilizing vehicles on private driveways shouldn't be difficult, Mark answered. The room grew noticeably quieter. A management representative flipped through paperwork before pushing the folder back toward him. "This hearing isn't about debating policy," someone muttered. Mark gathered his documents without raising his voice. As he walked toward the exit, one board member called after him. "The clamp stays until every dollar is paid." Mark paused near the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Understood," he said. Outside, standing beneath the fading afternoon sunlight, he pulled out his phone and made one final call. This time, he wasn't contacting the HOA. And the person answering had authority the board never expected would become involved. The shift in power didn't happen with a dramatic courtroom outburst or a shouting match in the middle of the street. It happened quietly. Less than 48 hours after Mark made that final phone call, the documents he had spent hours reviewing in his garage landed on the desks of people trained to read them carefully. The original declarations governing the community were examined alongside later amendments, archived meeting records, and the notices the HOA had issued against him. What emerged painted a very different picture from the one the board had been presenting. The HOA unquestionably had authority to enforce certain community standards. It could issue notices, conduct hearings, and impose fines within the limits established by its governing documents and applicable law. But nowhere in the materials provided did there appear to be language authorizing the use of wheel clamps on vehicles parked entirely on privately owned residential driveways. Then came an even more troubling discovery. A late amendment, adopted years after the neighborhood was built, specifically narrowed certain enforcement practices involving resident vehicles. The amendment emphasized that actions affecting private property had to remain within clearly defined limits and follow established procedures. Mark hadn't stumbled across a loophole. He had uncovered a boundary. The police chief's office reviewed the circumstances, not as a disagreement over landscaping violations or unpaid assessments, but as a question of whether a private vehicle had been physically restrained without clear authority to do so. Soon, additional questions began circulating. Who approved the wheel clamping policy? When had residents voted on it? Was there documentation supporting the practice? Had similar enforcement actions been used against other homeowners? Archived meeting minutes revealed that concerns about overreaching enforcement had surfaced before. Warnings had been raised. Questions had been asked. They simply hadn't been taken seriously. For weeks, the HOA had relied on the assumption that no one would challenge its interpretation of the rules. Now, the same board that demanded documentation from homeowners was being asked to produce documentation of its own. And for the first time since the yellow clamp appeared in Mark's driveway, the people enforcing the rules found themselves answering difficult questions instead of asking them. By the time the next HOA meeting began, word of the dispute had spread throughout the neighborhood. Residents arrived earlier than usual, filling nearly every folding chair inside the community clubhouse. Conversations that normally revolved around landscaping schedules and pool maintenance had been replaced by quiet speculation. People whispered in small groups, glancing toward the front of the room where the board members sat behind a long conference table stacked with binders and neatly arranged files. The steady hum of the air conditioning was the only sound when Mark walked through the doors carrying the same slim folder he had brought before. Only this time, the atmosphere felt different. He took his seat, waited patiently for the meeting to begin, and listened as routine agenda items were addressed. Then, when public comments opened, Mark stood and approached the table. His voice remained calm. Can someone identify the section of the governing documents that authorizes placing wheel clamps on vehicles parked entirely on privately owned driveways? He asked. Silence. One board member immediately began flipping through a binder. Another adjusted his glasses and stared down at the paperwork in front of him. No one answered. Mark placed copies of the relevant documents onto the conference table. Can anyone identify the vote in which homeowners approved this policy? He continued. The silence grew heavier. Residents shifted in their seats. Whispers spread through the room. Finally, the community's legal counsel cleared his throat and examined the materials that had been provided. Several long moments passed before he looked up. We have been unable to locate documentation granting that specific authority, he said carefully. The room erupted into stunned murmurs. A resident near the back let out a nervous laugh before quickly covering his mouth. Another homeowner shook his head in disbelief. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The same board that had issued repeated citations over paperwork deficiencies now struggled to produce paperwork supporting one of its most aggressive enforcement actions. Then came the statement that changed everything. The wheel clamp should never have been installed, legal counsel said. For a brief moment, the entire clubhouse fell silent. Board members who had once spoken with absolute confidence avoided eye contact. One slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Across the room, residents exchanged astonished looks. After weeks of intimidation and uncertainty, the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and everyone had heard it. The morning the wheel clamp finally came off, there was no applause from gathered neighbors and no dramatic celebration in the street. Instead, it happened with quiet efficiency. A security contractor arrived shortly after sunrise carrying a toolbox and a clipboard. The same black pickup truck that had sat trapped in Mark's driveway for weeks remained exactly where it had been, except this time the atmosphere surrounding it had changed. The tension that had once drawn curious stares from passing neighbors had been replaced by something closer to relief. Mark stood a few feet away, with his hands in his pockets, as the heavy metal device was unlocked and carefully removed from the front tire. The sharp click of the mechanism releasing sounded strangely satisfying. No speeches were made. No one argued. After weeks of embarrassment and uncertainty, the truck was simply free to leave. Over the following days, the consequences of the HOA's actions began unfolding through official channels. The enforcement charges directly related to the wheel clamp were formally withdrawn. Administrative fees tied to the unauthorized action were cancelled. Notices connected to the disputed enforcement measures were reviewed by the community's legal counsel and management company. Residents who had quietly accepted questionable penalties in the past suddenly started asking their own questions. How many other fines had been issued without proper documentation? Were appeal procedures being followed consistently? Had homeowners been given the transparency they were entitled to under the governing process? In response, an independent review of several enforcement practices was recommended. At the next community meeting, attendance reached record levels. Homeowners who had never before participated in HOA affairs filled the clubhouse seats. Some arrived carrying folders of old correspondence. Others simply came to listen. New proposals were introduced. Residents requested clearer notice requirements before penalties could be imposed. They asked for written explanations supporting enforcement decisions and expanded access to records related to hearings and appeals. Most importantly, they demanded accountability. As election season approached, several board members chose not to seek re-election. Others resigned before their terms expired. New candidates campaigned on transparency, consistency, and adherence to the governing documents rather than aggressive enforcement. The neighborhood didn't descend into chaos. The HOA wasn't abolished. Rules still existed because many residents believed reasonable standards had value when applied fairly. But the experience changed the community's understanding of authority. The people enforcing the rules were expected to follow them too. A few days later, Mark climbed into his pickup truck and backed slowly out of the driveway for the first time since the ordeal began. The familiar sound of the engine filled the quiet suburban street. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Neighbors tended their lawns. The electronic gate opened and closed in the distance as another ordinary day unfolded. Life in the neighborhood moved forward. Not because anyone sought revenge, but because a community had been reminded that accountability works best when it applies equally to everyone, including those sitting at the head of the table. Narrator says, the visuals in this video are AI generated for educational and entertainment purposes. This story is a dramatization based on composite real-world scenarios. It does not depict real individuals or specific events. Any similarities are coincidental. When people hear stories about homeowners associations, they often assume the conflict is simply about rules versus residents. But situations like this reveal something much deeper. The issue was never whether neighborhoods should have standards. Most homeowners understand the importance of maintaining shared spaces, protecting property values, and creating communities where people feel safe and proud of where they live. The real question is what happens when authority expands beyond the limits it was given. In this neighborhood, a disagreement that began with violation notices and mounting fines evolved into a larger lesson about accountability. A wheel clamp attached to a pickup truck became a reminder that homeowners should understand not only the rules they agree to follow, but also the boundaries placed on those responsible for enforcing them. Mark didn't resolve the situation through anger, threats, or revenge. He asked questions. He reviewed documents. He requested explanations. And when the answers didn't align with the authority being exercised, he pursued the matter through lawful channels until transparency replaced assumption. That's a lesson that extends far beyond any single HOA dispute. Whether it's a neighborhood association, a management company, or any organization entrusted with responsibility, accountability matters most when it applies equally to everyone involved. Knowing your rights doesn't mean refusing to follow reasonable rules. It means understanding where those rules begin and where they end. Now we want to hear from you. If your HOA, property manager, or neighborhood board took an action that didn't seem authorized, would you challenge it and ask for proof, or would you simply pay the fine and move on to avoid the stress? Share your experience and thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing a similar situation. And if you enjoy HOA stories centered on property rights, neighborhood disputes, and homeowners standing up through legal and procedural accountability, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who believes that fairness should never depend on who holds the power.